Page 26. The Art and Science of Low Carbohydrate Living. An expert guide to making the life-saving benefits of carbohydrate restriction sustainable and enjoyable. By Jeff S. Volek and Stephen D. Phinney. Section 1. Chapter 1. Overview of low carbohydrate and ketogenic diets. 1.1. Historical perspective. Who invented the low-carbohydrate diet? Was it Dr. Robert Atkins' weight loss revolution in 1972? Or Wilder and Peterman's anti-seizure diet at the Mayo Clinic in the 1920s? Or perhaps Banting's pamphlet in Britain in 1863? The answer, none of the above. But for sure, it was long before these recorded efforts to codify and monetize carbohydrate restriction. This does not in any way discount the contributions of these contrarian pioneers who attempted to steer us away from our sometimes fatal romance with agricultural carbohydrates. But to understand the origins of low-carbohydrate metabolism and to appreciate how deeply it is rooted in our basic human physiology, we need to go back hundreds of thousands of years, if not a million or two. Current evidence suggests that our human ancestors evolved in Africa and then spread across the globe in successive waves of migration. And while that original African ancestral group may have developed in a tropical environment where fruit and tubers could be foraged year-round, our ability as humans to migrate into barren or temperate regions depended upon our ability to survive prolonged periods of fasting, and to adapt to hunting and gathering of less carbohydrate-rich fare. And eventually, this evoked tolerance of a low-carbohydrate diet allowed some humans to become highly specialized hunters and herders, living as mobile cultures in rhythm with the animals that fed them. Recent examples of these low-carbohydrate nomadic cultures were the Maasai herdsmen in Central Africa, the bison people of the North American Great Plains, and the Inuit in the Arctic. But long before these last low-carbohydrate cultures were finally suppressed by the agricultural imperative, much of the world's populace subsisted, if not thrived, on continuous or intermittent carbohydrate restriction. For example, agricultural carbohydrates such as wheat and rye did not come north of the Alps until brought by the Romans after the time of Christ. The Irish, Scandinavians, and Russians had no agricultural carbohydrates suitable to their climate until the potato immigrated to Europe from the Andes in the 16th century AD. What this means is that many of our ancestors had little exposure to high proportions of dietary carbohydrate until 2,000 years ago, and for many Aboriginal cultures, their choice of a low-carbohydrate lifestyle persisted to within the last few hundred years. Now fast forward to the present. The United States is currently reassessing a 3-decade, uncontrolled experiment in which carbohydrates were lauded and fats demonized. Concurrently, we have become one of the most obese countries in the world. And across the globe, tragically, indigenous peoples with historically low carbohydrate intakes now have extremely high prevalence rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes, for example, the Gulf states in the Middle East, Pacific Islanders, First Nations in Canada, and Australian Aborigines. What these observations suggest is that for many humans, from an evolutionary perspective, a high-carbohydrate diet is a metabolic challenge that some find difficult as early as adolescence and many fail to meet in the middle years of life. Equally apparent is that these negative effects of a high carbohydrate intake can be forestalled or reduced by vigorous exercise, high intakes of micronutrients and/or fiber from vegetables and fruit, avoidance of simple sugars, and constant energy restriction. For many of us with severe obesity, metabolic syndrome, or overt type 2 diabetes, however, these healthy lifestyle choices are not enough to fully counteract the negative effects of a substantial contribution of carbohydrate to our daily energy intake. This condition, in which a collection of diseases characterized by insulin resistance are driven by consumption of a single nutrient class, deserves to be identified as carbohydrate intolerance. and as with other single nutrient intolerances, for example, lactose, gluten, fructose, the preferred intervention is to reduce one's dietary intake below the threshold level that produces symptoms. Page 29.